stand at the door, and if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me. When he says, I'll come and dine with him in the first century, that was the most intimate thing you could do with somebody is to invite them into your home and share a meal. Remember the days and times, now you know we're going to date a lot of us, but you remember the days and times where you had people over? I mean, not just one person over, you had several people over. You had your friends, neighbors, loved ones, that sort of thing. And how good it was, and how close people were, and how much people used to go out of their way to help each other and share what they had with each other, until we built garages and door closers and stuff like that. We close that door on Friday and we don't come out till Monday, sort of thing. But that's exactly what was going on there, and that's exactly what Jesus said. You know, I want to have that kind of relationship with you. And that's what he's describing. Verse 20, he's talking about the right now. We've been talking about the right now and not yet. Verse 20 is describing the right now. And verse 21 is describing the not yet. Because he who overcomes, I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne and overcome. I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. In other words, what he's saying is, one of these days I'm going to share with you everything I've got. Okay? I'm going to share with you all the things that we've got in heaven, and you're going to see and hear things and do things that you never thought was possible. I know a lot of people think that they don't want to go because they think it's just going to be a bunch of hymn singing up there, and that's what we're going to have is an eternity of hymn singing. And a lot of people just don't want to go to that. So, and I think that's far from what heaven's going to be. Okay? Now, Jesus is inviting us to the right now. The not yet is going to come later. And a lot of times we can't wait to get out of the right now to get to the not yet, because we give anything to get out of the right now, and the right now might be the best thing that ever happened to you, regardless of what it feels like and regardless of what it looks like. And we can't see that until we progress and get down the road. Now here's the thing, when Jesus, he's making an invitation here. And if you read your Bible, and I know you do, there's all kind of invitations that Jesus gives. And he's given one here in Revelation 3:20. He's knocking on doors. I don't know how long ago this was, but Cincinnati, to give you a comparison, the city of Cincinnati is about twice the size of Louisville. Okay? I don't know what the population is because, you know, they keep lying about it and all that so we can be bigger than other people. But nonetheless, Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever you think about it doesn't make any difference. That's not the issue. They spent one summer knocking on every single door in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Wow.
Now, you might disagree with their theology, but you can't disagree with what they were attempting to do, because they believed what they believed, and they wanted people to know that. And we need to be doing likewise. And Jesus is simply knocking on the door. And that's exactly what he's saying. He's not knocking on a literal door. He's knocking on people's hearts. He's trying to get into people's lives. Okay? Who's doing the knocking? Jesus is, right? What happens when people knock on our doors? How do we respond? What do we do when people are knocking on our doors? We let them in, right? But whose door is he knocking? Here's the question this morning. Whose door is he knocking on? He's knocking on the church door. He's writing this to a church. And this church happens to be Laodicea. Not that he's excluding the other six. There's 7 churches that he writes to. And if you read these letters, they apply to any church today in existence. But he's knocking on the church door. Okay? And he's asking the church to let him in. You hear what he's saying? I'm out there, outside this building, and I'm trying to get in. Or I'm outside of your life, and I'm trying to get in. And you and I know that not everybody's going to let him in. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting in here or you've never been in a place like this. Certain people are just not going to let him in. You could spend your lifetime in a place like this and never let him in. Now, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to hear that. But that's a fact. That's a fact. That means he's standing outside of us, trying to get inside. We're talking about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, what does Jesus want? He wants a relationship with us. He wants to invite us into his kingdom. We have a kingdom, and we know what our kingdom is. And Jesus said, I want to invite you into my kingdom. I want to invite you into a whole new way of life, a whole new way to live. But you're not going to know what that is until you invite me in and you're willing to do that. His present kingdom, not his future kingdom. We're talking about the right now. The not yet will come later. And he talks about this in Matthew when he talked about the apostles asking how to pray. And he said in Matthew 6, he says, here's how I want you to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. What does he say next?
Thy kingdom come.
Thy will be done. Thy kingdom come and thy will be done. And that's what he's trying to get Christian people to do. If you look at 2 Chronicles 16:9, let me just read this and we'll go on. It says this, for the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he might strongly support those whose heart is completely his. He searches the world over, checking our hearts out, checking our lives out. And he wants to be a part of our lives in a way that he can get behind us and get in us and work through us and change the world so they can be in the kingdom and get the same things that you have, the benefits that you have. He gets behind us and strongly supports that if our hearts are right. Our hearts are completely his. He says, I want everything from you. I want an empty vessel to work with. Another invitation is he invites people to a meal. And that's not near what it used to be anymore, because when we invite somebody to a meal, what do? They in turn, well, it's my turn to buy, and we invite it, so it's just one thing or the other. But it was far more than that for Jesus. It was the most intimate thing you could do with somebody in that century, in that day and time, in that culture. Now, who do we normally invite when we invite people to eat? Well, family, friends, people that we're close with. And Jesus said, why don't you have a meal for the people that can't afford to eat? Those who are actually hungry, because there's nobody really in here hungry until about noon, right? And noon, we're doing this. Time out, let's get out of here, let's go. The Baptists are already there, and we got to get in line and all that stuff. But Jesus said, why don't you invite somebody who really needs a meal? Because if you're like me, you could maybe stand not to eat today. But Matthew 5:6, I think, says that blessed are those happy, joyful, whatever word you want to put there that would fit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for the right thing. In other words, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for me. And when you hunger and thirst for him, you're going to be satisfied, as it says. Now, people who don't want to come to your invitation, they're going to come up with excuses, right? You've made it yourself. Maybe you've even lied about why you couldn't come. Now, I know none of you here will do this, but I bet you know some people who do, right? All right. Those of you that laugh, you need to come forward after service. But here's some of the excuses in this story that Jesus gives. We're not going to get into the story. We don't have time. But in the story, here's the excuses these guys gave. Well, I'm buying a farm. Well, if you're buying a farm, you've already looked at it. You've already checked it out. And you probably know what a farm is. And you probably already know what you're buying, or you wouldn't be looking at it. Right? In other words, Jesus said, you can't fit me in but you got to go look at the farm, but you don't have time to fit me in. All right, second illustration he gave, they're going to buy some cows. Like farmers have never seen cows before, you know. Buying cows for the first time, I don't know what it is, but they probably have seen cows before, but I got to go see these cows and I'll catch you later. Or the third one, they said, well, I just married a woman. I just got married. Of the three, that's probably the best. But it still won't float. Jesus said, well, why don't you bring her with you? Didn't do it. Okay? Question for us is, what excuses do we make to keep Jesus from being all in our lives? I mean, all in. We're not talking about Sunday and Wednesday, maybe read our Bible, maybe take communion, maybe throw an offering in the plate. You mean there's more? Yes, there's a lot more than that. Yes, everything about your life. Jesus touches everything about your life. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And what excuses are we making to keep control of our lives and not turning the control of our lives over to Him? Because we make them whether we realize it or not. It appears that when we read these stories that these people were saying that there's things more important than you, Jesus, and that's what I'm going to take care of. And if I've got time, or I make time, I'll get with you when I can, if at all. Because we're making excuses, right? These people really didn't want what Jesus was selling. They really didn't want what He's offering. And who are we talking about? We're talking about the church, because that's who He's writing to. I would like to change this and say He's talking to lost people, but He's talking to the church, because He's writing to a church, specifically a church. One particular church in mind, Laodicea church. And it wasn't like the other six didn't need the same message, because they passed these letters around to churches. But He's specifically talking to one church. He's not talking to the lost world there specifically. Now this brings us to a basic question of a fundamental importance. Turn over to John 14:15. He says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Right? If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Turn over to John chapter 14. John chapter 14 and look at verse 21. John 14:21. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him, and I will disclose myself to him. In other words, I'll make myself available for you 24/7. We're talking about God here making Himself available to us if we're willing to do these things. Drop down to verse 31. But so that the world might know that I love the Father, I do exactly what the Father commanded me. Get up and let's go from here. What was He saying to these guys? He was teaching these guys that this is exactly what I want you to do. If you want this kind of life and you want to follow me, then here's the requirements. Chapter 15, verse 10. John chapter 15, verse 10. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commandments, and I get to abide in His love. If I don't keep these commandments, I'm not going to be able to abide in this kind of relationship, because I'm breaking the relationship. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves every single day when we start our day is, does God have anything to offer us really? I mean, has God ever really made a difference in my life? Have I allowed God to make a difference in my life? Does He really have the power and ability? Does His words really mean anything at all in my everyday life? Do these words really integrate any part of my life Monday through Saturday? And a lot of people would say no. Because they're not keeping the commandments. They're not having a relationship with God. They're not all in. They've got other things going on in their life that's far more important than this stuff right here. Okay? Reading the Bible, I don't understand it anyway. It's an old ancient book. Who can understand it? Or do we love something more? It's our call. God is not pressuring us. You know, it's our call. You can do it or not do it. I'm going to give you free will, and it's your choice. What are you going to do? Because it's up to you. When you walk out these doors, it's on you what you're going to do with it. But remember, you need to keep this in mind. One day we're all going to die, and we're going to stand before him, and none of these people here are going to be there to speak up for us. It's just going to be you and Jesus one-on-one for about 30 seconds. And however long it takes to say what he's going to say. Welcome, or I never knew you. Won't take long, right? Now, I think we'd all agree we let way too many things take the place of what's most important. If we think this is most important, we wind up letting way too many things get in the way of what's most important. And 2 Chronicles 16:9 that we just read, what we didn't read was the latter part of that verse, and here's what it says. 2 Chronicles 16:9, the last part of it, he said, you've acted foolish in this. Okay? Indeed, from now on, you're going to have wars. What he's saying basically is this, so we can go on. He's saying if you're not going to listen to me, you're not going to obey me, you're not going to follow me, you're not going to go all in, you're going to have more trouble than you can handle. Because life is not going to work for you because it never was intended to work unless you had a relationship with him. Now, back to Revelation 3:20. Let's look at that one more time. Make sure we get this thing down. He says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him. There's that meal. There's that fellowship. There's that relationship. And he with me. Okay? Now, have you ever gone out of your way that you don't have to nod or look at anybody or poke anybody? But I think many times we get involved in so many things in the church to avoid the things that we don't want to do. In other words, we get involved in so many things that we are okay doing where we can throw some money at or give a little time and not really get involved in what the main thing is. And what do you think the main thing is in Scripture? It's to know him and have a personal relationship with him and to do what he tells us to do because he wired us, he made us, he created us, and he knows what works in us. It's as simple as mechanics, as a manufacturer building something. They built it. They know what they put in it. They tell you what kind of oil, what kind of gas to put in it. They tell you how to maintain it. They tell you what will work and what won't work. And if you deviate from that, it's not going to last. It's going to go haywire. And God is saying that's exactly what happens to our lives. We go out of our way many times to avoid doing the main thing because the last thing Christian people want to do is tell somebody else that they're lost or tell somebody, do you want to give your life to Jesus? Right? That's why we see so few people in church, right? It's not because people wouldn't come. It's because people don't know what we're offering. Several weeks in the last 3 or 4 weeks in messages, I've tried to get to Philippians and I ran out of time. So this morning I want to take time. If we don't get any further than this, then we'll at least get into Philippians. Chapter 3, starting with verse 7. Philippians 3:7. Now, I love this passage, and I probably read it a lot because Paul is pouring his heart out here about the life that he left and the life he has right now. And he says, there's no, as good as life was, or at least I thought it was, the life that I had. I came from the right family. I was born at the right time. I was blessed by having the right last name. I got to go to the right schools. I got all the benefits. I got all the opportunities anybody could ever get. I got into a profession, and I rose to the top of my profession. I had political connections. I had corporate connections. I had money. I had all the benefits anybody, in other words, I had the American dream going. And he says, the Lord called me out of that, and now that I'm looking back, he said, there's no comparison to that life and the life I have with Christ. And he spent most of his time in prison. Now, I dare say that there's not anybody here, especially me, that would like to say, Lord, just take the life that I had and forget that and just put me in prison for the rest of my life and let me hang out with the boys. And I'll tell them about Jesus. Now, listen to what he says here in verse 7. Whatever things were gained to me, all those things, that money, influence, power, connection, everything going for me. I mean, there wasn't anything that Paul wasn't having going in his favor. But whatever things were gained to me, I counted as loss for the sake of knowing Jesus Christ. Meaning, he's saying, once you come to know him, there's no comparison to anything you've ever experienced. That's hard for even Christian people to wrap their minds around, because they haven't been willing to go in far enough to have that kind of relationship. It's a little more than coming to services, right? You already know that. More than that, in verse 8, I count all things, not just a few. I count everything in view of the surpassing value of knowing Jesus Christ our Lord, whom I've suffered the loss of all things. I don't have any of those things anymore. And you say, well, Paul, don't you miss the money? Don't you miss your friend? Don't you miss your connection? Don't you miss your profession? Don't you miss all the benefits that came with everything you had going for it? Paul said, no, you couldn't compare what I had to what I'm having right now with a relationship with Jesus. He says, I've suffered the loss of all things, but count them rubbish. You don't want to know what that word rubbish means in the original language, so I'm going to go on. So that I might gain Jesus Christ. And may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law. In other words, he says, what I had before was a righteousness derived from the law. In other words, we made up our own religion. We made up our own belief system. And now that I know the right system, there's no comparison to the two. Religion, profession, relationships, whatever you want to throw in there. But that which is true faith in Christ Jesus, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith, belief, and trust in him. That I might know him. Here's what I love, is verse 10. All that so that I might know him and the power of his resurrection. We want to know him, and we want to experience the power of the resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. He can just keep that. I don't want to sign up for that. Because first of all, I don't know what that means. And if it means going to jail, if it means giving up all my stuff, I'm out of here. Forget that. Right? Okay. And being conformed to his death. You know, it might cost you your life if you follow Jesus. I'm not sure that's worth that. In order that I might attain to the resurrection from the dead. And he goes on and he says, I'm not there yet. Whatever you might think of Paul and however you might see Paul as a giant or whatever, he said, I'm not there yet. I'm going to have to get there. I'm struggling with some things. But he does say there's one thing, this one thing, that I forget what lies behind and reach forward to what lies ahead. In other words, I don't think about the right now, because if I thought about the past and the right now, it's going to drive me crazy. And I forget about that stuff, and I look forward to the not yet, because I know something better is coming. God is not going to continually send bad things your way and say there's no end to that until you die and go to heaven. Nobody will do that. But there's better things coming, the not yet, the things you haven't seen yet. Now, do we in the church, as individuals, see the value in a life with God? I mean, do we see it any different than any other relationship that we've got? Well, I got friends that I'm closer with than Jesus. I really don't know Jesus. I can't understand the Bible. I don't know how it works. I'm not around anybody that knows any of that stuff. So, yeah, I have a better relationship with friends than I do him, because I don't really know him. And that's the problem. He simply wants a relationship with you. And a relationship is a relationship. I don't care who you have it with. And I want him more than I want anything else or anybody else. It's all in or it's nothing at all. And he gives example after example that we don't have time in a couple of hours to explain all the different ways that he lays it out and said, that's what it's going to take. Because I'm searching the world for people who are going to give me their whole heart. And if they don't give me their whole heart, they're going to be miserable people. Do you know there's actually miserable people in church? Especially if you go overtime. I didn't want that. I didn't come here after an hour sermon. Give me 30. If you can't do 30 minutes, we'll get another preacher, you know. Isn't that great? We're going to spend eternity with him, and we only want 30 minutes, right? Get me out of here. Somehow that doesn't flow, does it? But you can take that up with him. But I know you don't. You take it up with me, okay? So that's an issue. Let me go on. Now, a lot of people think, you know, why would I do something like that anyway? Why would I give my life to Jesus? I don't know anything about him. I don't know if that's true or not. Well, you don't know if anything's true or not until you do it, right? But life with Jesus is priceless, is what Paul's saying. I wouldn't trade all the stuff that I had. And, you know, in other words, if you live the American dream, you're saying, what you would be saying is what Paul's saying. You can't compare the American dream to the relationship with Jesus, to the life of living for him. And the people that don't know that have never gone all in because they're afraid of what that looks like, or it's interfering with the life that they have right now, and they're not going to give you that. And Jesus would tell them, just go on back home. You're wasting your time. Because I can't work that way. I can't, you know. Your very job that you've had or still have has requirements, right? Doesn't your boss pretty much tell you what you're going to do? Do you tell your boss you're not going to do it? If you do, you're probably unemployed, right? But somehow the creator of the universe, we think we have options like McDonald's. Until you have that personal relationship, nothing is really much going to happen in your life. Nothing much is going to change because we're not to the point and place and time where we're willing to do that. 1 John says this. 1 John 2, 3 through 6, he says this. In verse 3, he says, if you want to know, John asked the question, do you want to know that you know him and have a relationship with him? You say, well, yeah. And he said, well, keep his commandments. If that's not enough, he says in verse 6, he says, if that's not enough, he says, you're going to have to live like him. And you have to look at your life and look at this right here and say, am I living the same way Jesus lived? We're not talking perfection here, okay? But we're talking about his word. Are we keeping his word in our life? Do we even read it? Do we even know what he says? I know these are tough things to hear. But folks, we're not talking about, you know, when we die, there are no second chances to this. You know, I know people think the 7-year tribulation is the second chance. I don't want to trust that myself. It's like Jerry was talking last week about, you know, people getting baptized again because they knew or they thought that they did it for the wrong reason and it didn't work. There's nothing going on there. And people, I've had probably a fourth of all the people that I've ever baptized. It's been the same thing that Jerry brought up. That they wanted to get baptized to make sure they did it right this time. And some even asked, they even questioned whether they should do it. I said, well, I got a quarter out, and I'll flip it in the air. Heads, you're going to get baptized, and tails, you won't. Is that what you want to do with your eternity? Heads, I go to heaven. Tails, I don't. I don't think so. But that's how we treat it sometimes, right? Now, the scriptures, and there's tons of them, and I'm skipping a ton of them. And it's saying that if you really knew him, what Paul's describing in Philippians 3, the unfathomable riches, the incalculable riches, the incomprehensible things that God can do in your life, inexhaustible things that God can do. In other words, there's no end to God. It doesn't matter how far you go into God, how well you know God, there's always more. God keeps on giving. He keeps on changing. He keeps on working in our life in ways that we didn't think we could ever go this far. We didn't think it could ever be that good. And that's what Paul's describing. I've got a relationship with him that I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. Money, power, nothing. If people were to ask you today, are you a disciple of Jesus? Are you a disciple of Jesus? See, we call ourselves Christians, but the Bible only talks about being a Christian 3 times in the New Testament. And it wasn't in a good way. They didn't know what else to call them. Jesus called them disciples. Because, see, the system in that day and time was if a rabbi called you men, let's say he called 12 men, you had to move in with that rabbi, and you had to do everything that rabbi did, everything he told you to do. You had to eat with him. You had to sleep in the same building. You spent 3 years with him before he would decide whether or not you could be a disciple. And you could either flunk out or you could make it through the program. And Jesus is saying, if you're going to be my disciple, you've got to do what I tell you to do. You got to listen to me. You got to follow me. And people today have thought that they surpassed that sort of thing, and I don't need anybody telling me what to do. And I don't want anybody telling me what to do. But if people were to ask you, are you a disciple of Jesus? Our response ought to be, well, who else would I follow? Where else would I go? Who else am I going to listen to in our day and time? If you want to go to some things, here, listen to this. What about Buddha? Would you follow Buddha? He's got a pretty good following. He doesn't exist, but you can follow him. He's got teachings, but he's not around anymore. Gandhi, he was a pretty good guy. He had some pretty good things to say. Are we going to follow him? If you're going to talk about the financial aspect of the world, if I was going to follow that, I'd talk to Elon Musk. He's going to be the first trillionaire by 2027, first trillionaire. There's never been a trillionaire. Not one person. Okay? If you're going to go politics, are you going to talk to Trump? If it's entertainment world, who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to go to instead of Jesus? Who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to allow to speak into your life? Nothing or no one compares to Jesus. Everybody, listen, all of us here, anybody you meet on the face of the earth, is following somebody or something without even sometimes realizing. But people are not thinking about what's guiding their life. What is it this morning that's guiding your everyday life? Is it you? Is it the people you listen to? Or is it Jesus? Who am I really following? Who do I look up to? Who are my role models? But whoever they are and whatever they are, everything else other than Jesus is limited, right? But God has power that's unlimited. Everything about him is unlimited. The question is, are we a disciple of Jesus? Are we listening to him? Are we obeying him? Well, let me wrap this up because we're out of time. Where are you this morning? Are you living life on your terms? Or are you living life on his terms? That's it. That's all there is. When you stand before him, it's going to be, you didn't do life on my terms, you did it on yours. Or, welcome home, good and faithful servant, because you listened to me and you followed. And the question is, if we need to make some changes, are we going to make changes? What are we going to do about it? Are we going to just, time to go, it's 12 o'clock, time to eat, we got more important things to do than to hear you rattle on. I would challenge you, don't leave here today before you decide how you're going to answer those questions. Because you don't know if you'll ever come back again. You don't know if you'll make it to the car or not. You don't know if you'll make it through the day or not. Because you're not in charge of that. You're not in control of it. As many vitamins you take and many visits as you go to the doctor, you don't have any guarantee. We've seen long-range runners in perfect health, no health problems whatsoever, drop dead and have a heart attack. And people like me that eat too many McDonald's and live forever. Yeah. But what are we going to do about these things? When are we going to get around to deciding? And hopefully you've already decided this. But isn't it amazing? We decide a lot of things and we get a lot of things in order before we die. And we don't think too much about where we're going to spend eternity. And whether we're ready to meet him or not. And whether we did it his way or whether we did it our way. It's your choice, your decision, as we stand and say.